All right, so in the previous lecture, we went to Monopoly, which is when we have one seller, which was a big departure from what we had been doing before, where we were looking at lots of buyers, lots of sellers, and perfect competition. But there's a lot of in between ground in between having just one person and having a whole bunch of people. So we're going to kind of get at that idea with this topic called game theory. Right. So since we have these ground rules for what the world was going to be like when we had perfect competition, and we have these rules for what life was going to be like for when we had monopoly. But we haven't really talked about this lower level competition or even coordination if we wanted to do that. So what's going to happen if we start in this world where we've got a small number of agents, just one, and let's just say we added one or two. Okay, so what is this interaction going to be like? So that's what game theory is. It's the analysis of this interaction. So we could think of this as game theory as being analyzing any sort of strategic interaction between individuals. So that could be something like playing a game of checkers, evolutionary success. There's actually an entire branch of that one called evolutionary game theory. How much quantity a firm should produce, given maybe there's another firm that might enter the market, and whether or not you and your roommate want to purchase a TV or not. Okay, so all these sorts of things are strategic interaction, and we can get at them through game theory. Okay, so given the name that we got, game theory, we kind of use our names for this sort of thing are all kind of game related. Okay, so our agents that are playing these games, we call them players. Okay, and we're gonna have two or more games. Okay, otherwise, it wouldn't be interesting. Strategies are going to be available to each player. So in other words, they have to have some ability to choose some sort of strategy. And we have to be able to know what their payoffs are for certain outcomes. Okay, so based off your decision, based off of your opponent's decisions, what is going to be the outcome that you would get. Okay, some assumptions. We assume that agents are rational. That's normally what we assume. Of course, we should remember that agents being rational in economics isn't the same thing as maybe you might think of if you weren't thinking of it in economics context. For example, drug users, we may not think of them as being rational people in general. However, if someone if they get a huge utility from using drugs, then they're maximizing their utility function. So, in an economic sense, that would be we're assuming that they're rational. Okay, obviously that's not the same as what you would normally consider rational. We also assume that agents only care about their own payoffs. So that may throw you off for a second because you may think, well, I care about how well other people do. Say I get flowers for my significant other for some sort of holiday, and I do that. Why? Well, maybe because maybe my significant other will be nicer to me if I get flowers. However, maybe she likes getting flowers, and maybe I like making her feel happy, right? So if we're living in that world where we get utility from those things, well, I could get the direct benefits from giving flowers, such as her being nicer to me. But we could also have it such that it felt good to give flowers. Right, so I'm going to put W in there. That's just for warm glow, some sort of good feeling I get from doing something nice. Okay, so my utility might be a function of those types of things. So in other words, my payoffs have that sort of thing internalized already. Okay, so if I'm interested in my payoffs, well, it could be that my payoffs are a function of someone else's payoffs, so it's okay. Okay, so the first type of game we're going to look at are simultaneous games where people make decisions at the exact same time. And these simultaneous games are also known as normal form games. So if you see normal form game, it's the same thing as a simultaneous game. Okay. So this particular example, just some of the typical things that you might see in a normal form game. We've got a couple of players, and we could call this player A, player 1. By convention, player A, player 1 is a row player. Okay, in other words, these moves that are rows are the moves of that player. Okay, so player 1, player A, has row moves, buy or don't buy. Okay, we've got player 2, player B. By convention, player 2, player B is always going to be the column player. So in other words, this buy, this don't buy represents their strategies. Okay. So, what are the numbers? The first number in each cell, as you might expect, goes to player 1. The second number, as you might expect, goes to player 2. Okay, and in this particular case, it's not always going to be the case, but in this particular case, we actually color-coded it. So player B is blue, and we can see all these moves are player B's payoffs for these different circumstances. Okay, so these circumstances are based on the choices that they make. So in other words, if player A buys, that means that this row is going to be what happens. And player B buys, that means that this row is what's going to happen. Then this cell right here is going to be the one we end up in. And player B, in that circumstance, will get a payoff of 50. Player 1 will get a payoff of negative 50 as well. Okay. However, if player A buys, in other words, we're using this column, and player B doesn't buy, well, player B is going to get a payoff of 100, and player A is going to get a payoff of negative 50. Okay? So, by the way, this is a nice representation of free writing. We talked about free writing in the externalities extensions chapter, so this is just kind of another way to show that. Okay? So, where are we going with this? What are we trying to get to? Well, we would like to solve this game, in other words. And the solution concept that we're going to use to solve this game is called a Nash equilibrium. Okay, and the Nash equilibrium is a point where no one can have a unilateral incentive to deviate from if that's where they are at. It's named by John Nash. That name might sound a little familiar to you because Russell Crowe played him in a movie called A Beautiful Mind. He won the Nobel Prize in 1994 for his work in game theory. I'm going to put the slides up, and you can click that, and it's actually a scene from the movie A Beautiful Mind. If you want to watch that, be careful when you're watching that, though, because normally what I do in a normal class is I would let you guys watch that and point out what he's describing in this movie, in this scene. It is actually not a Nash equilibria. It is not a Nash equilibria. So I'd like you to, if you want to give that clip a watch, think about why it's not a Nash equilibria. Specifically, ask yourself this question with what they go through in that video. Is what they're describing a place where no party of interest has an incentive to unilaterally deviate from? Okay, unilaterally just means you do it on your own, right? So he was recently, well, not so recently anymore, a few years back now, he was killed with his wife in a taxi accident. All right, so what are the steps to actually finding the Nash equilibrium? Well, first step is we put ourselves in one of the player's shoes. Okay, we pretend we're going to be one of the player, and the other player is our opponent. Okay, and we're going to find our best response to whatever our opponent's going to do. In other words, we're gonna say, well, if they do this, this is what I'm going to do. But if they do that, And this is what I'm going to do. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. We're going to pick something that our opponent's going to do. We're going to hold that action constant and say, what is our best response for that? And we're going to do that for every single one of their strategies. Okay, so let's demonstrate that. So let's assume I'm player A. Okay, I'm player A. That means I've got two strategies available to me. I got don't buy and I've got buy. Okay, and of course I know that my opponent, they could also buy or not buy. Okay, so that's the setup that we're in. So I'm going to assume that my opponent picks a particular action and is going to hold that action constant. Okay, so in other words, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that player B, player 2, is going to buy. Okay, if that happens, well, then they're not going to not buy. Excuse me, they're double negatives. Double negatives are hard. That means that they're the don't buy action strategy is not going to happen. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of blank that out. If I was working this on paper, maybe I'd just cover it up with my hand. Okay, so if I'm living in this world where player 2, I know for sure, is going to buy, well, then I've got a couple of choices. I could buy or not buy. If I buy, then this is going to be the cell that I end up in. And again, the first number is going to be my payoff, the payoff of player 1. That's whose shoes I'm stepping into. So I would get a payoff of negative 50 if I did that. On the other hand, if I don't buy, I'm going to get a payoff of 100. That sounds pretty good to me. That's better than 50. Okay, so the best choice for me, given that the player buys, is to choose 100. Or excuse me, to don't buy, and I get 100, because 100 is better than 50, negative 50 if I buy. Okay, so I'm going to leave that circled. I'm going to leave this bit circled to denote that that is my best response. Okay, now let's take a look at if I know that they're going to don't buy. Okay, if they don't buy, well, again, I've still got the same choices. I've got buy or don't buy. And if I buy, then this is the cell I'll end up in. And I'll get a payoff of negative 50. Okay? But if I don't buy, I'll get a payoff of 0. 0 is going to be better than negative 50. So I'm going to leave that circle. And I'm going to say that's my best response. Okay? So I've found all the best responses for player B. Or excuse me, for player A, given choices by player B. But now, let's put ourselves into player B's shoes and see what their best responses are to player 1. Okay, so we're going to do the same thing here. So now I'm putting myself in the shoes of player B, and I can buy or don't buy, and player 1 can also buy or don't buy. Okay. So I'm going to do the same thing I did. I'm going to hold something constant. I'm going to say, well, what if player A buys? Okay, if player A buys, then we know we're going to be working in this row. And I've got the choice to buy and be in this cell. And if I'm in that cell, I get a payoff of negative 50. Or I could don't buy and be in this cell. If I'm in that cell, then I get a payoff of 100. 100 is better than negative 50, so I'm going to don't buy. I'm going to don't buy. Okay? But now, let's assume that player A does not buy. Player A does not buy. Again, I've got two choices. I've got buy or don't buy. And if I buy, I'll end up in this cell. Okay? If I end up in this cell, then I'll get a payoff of negative 50. And if I don't buy, then I'll end up in this cell. And if I end up in that cell, I'll get a payoff of 0. 0 is better than negative 50, so I'm going to don't buy again. Okay, so notice that there is only one cell that contains a best response for both of us, a mutual best response, and that's going to be don't buy, don't buy. Okay, we've got, in other words, both of our numbers are circled here. Okay, so I'm going to put a little star by that, denoting that that is our Nash equilibrium. Okay? Right? So uh, let's recall the definition of a Nash equilibrium. We can use this to double check our answer. So let's look back at our answer. So our definition is that we're in a place where we can't have both of us, or one of us rather, be either one of us be better off with unilateral action. Okay, in other words, if we're in this world where we're gonna don't buy, I as either player A or player B can't change that move and be better off. I might be just as good off, but I can't be better off. So let's see if that's true. Okay, so let's say I'm player A. Okay, now at the equilibrium here, I am not buying. So my only other choice is to buy. So can I be better off making a change, going to buy? Well, no, because I'm making 0 payoff now, but I'll be losing 50 if I change. Okay, and it's elementary to go through why that would also be the case for player B. If player B changed, these numbers are symmetrical in this case. They don't have to be. In this case, they're exactly symmetrical, so we know right away. Definitely that's not going to be the case. Okay. All right. So let's go through a few things what we call toy games. So these toy games are just some games with some particular situations, and we use them in order to describe things in real life for one reason or another. So this first toy game, and again, these toy games usually have some sort of a story with them. So this first toy game is called A Prisoner's Dilemma. This is probably the most famous game theory game. And the deal with The Prisoner's Dilemma is that we've got two criminals, and these criminals are big shot criminals. They're some bad folks, but they get arrested for a lesser charge. Okay, so a lot of times some of these examples will talk about Al Capone. So Al Capone was a leader of the mafia, but he got arrested for a lesser charge. He got arrested for tax evasion. So something like that. And let's say that we get these two criminals and we put them in separate rooms. Okay? And the police want to get some info on these bigger crimes they committed, but they need a confession from at least one of them. So if you confess, you're going to get 8 years in prison. If you both don't confess, you keep your mouth shut, you each get 1 year in prison, so big difference there. And if you rat the other guy out and they keep their mouth shut, you get off with no jail time, and they get 10 years in prison. And of course, if you keep your mouth shut and they rat you out, you get 10 years in prison and they get off. Okay? So what would you do? So take a minute and think about what you would do if this was the only thing that could happen. Obviously, in real life, if you were criminals, you might have some other things that you might be thinking about. Maybe they would make some threats on family and things like that. You'd be afraid for things like that. But let's assume in this case, this is the only thing that could happen. Only bad thing. Okay? So we could represent that in a normal form like this. Okay? So, in other words, if prisoner 1 confesses and prisoner 2 does not confess, keeps his mouth shut, well, prisoner 1 is going to get off scot-free. Prisoner 2 goes to jail for 10 years. So we represented that with a negative 10. Okay? If we both confess, we both get 8 years. If we both lie, we both get 1 year. In other words, they can't get us on the major charge. They're just going to get us for the lesser charge. Okay? So, what is the Nash equilibria here? And what makes this a dilemma? We call it a prisoner's dilemma. Why do we call it that? Well, let's go through and maybe we can figure this out. All right, so first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put myself in prisoner 1's shoes. Okay, if I put myself in prisoner 1's shoes, well, I've got two choices that I can make. I can confess, I can lie. And I know that prisoner 2 has the same choices. They can confess and lie. So now let's figure out my best responses. Okay, so to my opponent's action. So let's say my opponent confesses. Okay, that means that we're only dealing with this column here, because if they confess, well, they can't also lie. Okay, so if I'm dealing with this column only, I've got a couple of things that I could do. I could confess, and get a payoff of -8. I could lie and get a payoff of -10. Well, -8, that's going to be better off for me than -10, so I'm going to go with confessing. Okay? All right, so now let's see, well, what if we know that prisoner 2 is going to lie? Okay? If we know prisoner 2 is going to lie, that means we're going to deal with this column. Okay? If prisoner 2 lies, and I can confess and get a payoff of 0, or I could lie and get a payoff of -1. Okay, well, 0 is going to be better than -1. I'd rather get off scot-free, right? Okay, so I have chosen that no matter what, if prisoner 2 confesses or lies, I am going to confess as prisoner 1. And this is actually, again, we just saw, this is a symmetric game. Both players have similar numbers and similar circumstances, so we could actually very quickly just say, well, player 2 is going to confess in both circumstances. But since we may see non-symmetric stuff, let's go through the process anyway. Okay, so prisoner 2 is now who we're going to put ourselves in the shoes of. We can confess, we can lie, and our opponent can do the same thing. Okay. So let's say that prisoner 1, our opponent, is going to confess. That means we're going to use this this row, and we can't lie. Okay. So if that happens, I've got a choice between confessing and get a payoff of -8, or lying and getting a payoff of -10. Well, -10 is not as good as -8. Neither of them are great, but -10 is going to be better. So we've got a mutual best response here, so that's going to be our Nash equilibrium. And we look at lie, and we see, well, if prisoner 1 lies, then I, as prisoner 2, we would be on this row, and I would get to choose between confessing and getting a payoff of 0, or lying and getting a payoff of -1. Again, 0 is not as good as -1, so I'm going to lie. Okay, so we find that we have a Nash equilibrium, and it is to confess. So what makes this a dilemma? Well, we can look over here and we see that lie is definitely better for both of us. But we've got these individual incentives that stick us in confess. Okay, so that's why it's a dilemma. Okay, this is just a new concept called Pareto efficiency, and basically the way it goes is we can make a Pareto improvement if we can make someone better off and not hurt someone else. So can we do that here? Well, it depends on the circumstance. If we're in the Nash equilibria, can we make someone better off and not hurt someone else? Well, let's see. If prisoner 1 went to lies, in other words, we were in this cell, well, prisoner 2 is going to be much better off. Okay, prisoner 2 is going to be better off. They're at a payoff of 0 as opposed to -8. So that's good for them, but prisoner 1, they're actually worse off. Okay, so that's not a Pareto improvement. Okay, again, this is a symmetric game, so we could expect the same thing to happen if we were in this cell, in the confess, lie cell. And by the way, this is kind of how we write out these things. We put them in brackets, and we just say the first strategy is for the player 1, the second strategy is for player 2. So this cell would be confess lie. Okay, so if we were in confess lie, well, again, this is symmetric, so player 1 would be better off. They'd get 0 jail time. Okay, but player 2, they're going to be worse off. Okay, but what if we went to lie? Well, then we're both better off. Okay, so it turns out this situation of being in confess is Pareto inefficient. We can actually make an improvement for both of us. If we were in that cell, we could do something else, and we'd be both better off. So that's an interesting side effect of these incentives. Okay. That leads us to this idea of dominance. What's a dominant strategy? Well, we saw here that we were going to both of us really. We don't have. It doesn't have to be for both players, but in this particular circumstance, we saw that for both players, confessing was going to be what we were going to do. In other words, our strategy did not depend on whatever my opponent did. Okay, I'm always going to confess as player one. As player two, I'm always going to confess. Okay, so that's what we would call a dominant strategy. Is that you are going to do this strategy no matter what your opponent does. And lie is what we call dominated strategy. So lie is dominated. Okay. In other words, you're never going to choose lie no matter what your opponent does. Okay. And we can use this concept of dominated strategies to make more complicated games a little bit more simple. Okay. So this game right here, we could sit here and play this game exactly how we did before. It's a little different. It's got three moves for each player, but there's no real difference. For example, if I'm player one, so I'm the row player, and my opponent, player two, has left, center, right that they could choose. I can choose up, middle, down. Let's say that player two chooses left. If player two chooses left, well, I can choose up, middle, down, and get a payoff of 3, 1, or 0, respectively. Well, 3 is better, so I'm going to choose that. Okay, so it's really the exact same thing. Okay, but if you notice, if we went through this game, we would find that right would never get chosen. Okay, so why would right never get chosen? Well, let's see why. So let's put ourselves in player two's point of view. Okay, if we were player two, then let's hold player one's moves constant. Okay, so let's say player one moves up. Well, if player one moves up, then player two could move left, center, or right. In other words, they could get a payoff of 1, 1, or 0. Well, 1 is going to be better than 0. We actually had it for two different cells, so I circled both of them. Okay, they're both just as good, so we circled. What about if player 1 chooses middle? Well, if player 1 chooses middle, then I could choose left, center, or right, or get a payoff of 1, 1, or again 0. Again, just the same. I'm never going to choose the 0 because I've got these 1s. 1's better than 0. And as you can imagine, we've got the same situation if player 1 chooses down. I could get 1, 1, or 0. 0 again is the worst of the 3. So I'm never going to choose right as player 2. So if player 2 if right isn't really an option, it's never going to get chosen, then it doesn't actually affect our game. So we can actually just completely get rid of it, which is what I do with this big X. Okay? Once I've done that, I see that in this next graphic here that there could be another elimination. Okay, and I'll show you why that is. In other words, as we can see, we're going to eliminate middle. So why do we eliminate middle? Well, we're never going to choose middle. We're never going to choose middle. So let's see why. Let's put ourselves in player one's shoes again. Okay, so again, now we're going to play with this simplified game where player two can only choose left or center, and I can choose up, middle, or down as player one. So if player two chooses left, then I could choose up, middle, or down. Okay, well, I'm going to select up as my option. 3 is going to be better than 1 or 0. And what if player 2 decides to choose center? Well, I could choose up and get 0, middle and get 1, or down and get 4. Well, 4 is going to be the best choice. So I'm going to choose that. So notice I never chose middle. Okay, so middle is dominated. Okay, no matter what my opponent does, I'm not going to choose middle. So that can go away. And so we've managed to turn this bigger game into this smaller game. Okay, and if we solved this smaller game, it would actually give us the same result as if we were solving this bigger game. Okay, so let's kind of prove that. Okay, so we've got this smaller game here, and let's put ourselves in player 1's shoes first. Okay, so I'm going to choose up. Excuse me. I'm going to choose left for player 2 as what's going to hold constant. All right, so up and down are my choices. If player 2 chooses left, then I could choose up or down. I get a payoff of 3 for up, 0 for down. Well, 3 is better. What if player 2 chooses center? Well, I could get a payoff of 0 or 4. So I'm going to go with the 4 by going down. Okay. All right. So let's now put ourselves in the shoes of player 2. Okay. So player 2, I can choose left or right. Let's say my opponent chooses up. Well, if my opponent chooses up, then I could choose left and get 1, or right or center and get 1. Well, that's just as good as another, so I'm going to choose both of them. What if player 1 chooses down? Again, I get 1 either way, so I'm indifferent. Okay, and you notice that the results are the exact same as they were in this larger version. Okay, all right. So that is how another way we could play those games. You don't have to do that. You could just solve it for the regular way. Right? So here's another toy game. We're just going to do a few toy games. Normally I do extra credit here, but this is impossible really to do the way we're kind of doing the class right now. So we're going to skip that this time. So we've got toy games, another toy game. This one's called Battle of the Sexes. So this was a bit of a sexist 1950s stereotype, but it's interesting. And we also use some ambiguous names. So Chris and Pat could be male or female based off that name. So hopefully we try to get rid of some of the sexism with that. So the idea here is that Chris and Pat, this is from the 1950s, so they couldn't call each other to remember which place they were supposed to meet. Were they going to the opera or were they going to the fight? They can't remember. But they know they'd rather be with each other, but each has a preference. Okay? So that's why we've got these 2 different numbers that are going to be different from each other. But if they miscoordinate, so if one person goes to the fight and one person goes to the opera, like these cells, they're going to get the lowest payoff because they prefer to be with each other even if they've got these preferences. Okay? So let's go through this. Okay, so let's put ourselves in the shoes of Chris. So Chris can choose opera or fight, and Pat, Chris's opponent, and that's maybe a harsh word for trying to go on a date with someone, but just the language we use for this. So if Pat is going to choose opera, well, what would I rather do as Chris? Well, I don't want to miscoordinate. I don't want to be here. That's what I don't want. So if Pat's going to go to the opera, I'd prefer to go to the opera as well. So I'm going to choose 2. Okay? Excuse me, I'm going to choose opera, and I'm going to get a payoff of 2 if this is what happens, because Chris would rather go to the opera. But what if Pat wants to go to the fight? If Pat wants to go to the fight, or if Pat goes to the fight, then what am I better off doing? Well, I could go to the opera, or I could go to the fight. Well, again, we'd rather be at the same place. I get the 0 payoff if I go to the opera and Pat goes to the fight. So I'll go to the fight and get a payoff of 1. Okay, so that's not as good for Chris as the opera was, but it's still better than 0. Okay, so let's do the same thing for Pat. So let's say that put ourselves in Pat's shoes and say that let's say Chris goes to the opera. So what should Pat do? Well, if Pat goes to the opera, they'll get a payoff of 1, which is better than the 0 they would get if they miscoordinated. Okay, we got a mutual best response here, so that's a Nash equilibrium. So I put a little star there. But what if Chris goes to the fight? If Chris goes to the fight, again, we don't want to miscoordinate and get a payoff of 0. We'd rather go to the same place. And if we do, since Pat prefers the fight better than the opera, Pat is going to get a payoff of 2 there. So notice we've got some asymmetric outcomes here for each person. We have multiple Nash equilibria. So opera is 1, and fight is another. Okay. We could also have a situation where we don't have any Nash equilibria in what we would call pure strategies. There's always going to be a Nash equilibria if we do some randomization, but that's a little beyond the scope for the class, right? So if we're going to use pure strategies, so just whether or not we can do one thing or the other, there may be a situation where we don't have any equilibrium. Okay, so let's take a look at this one. So let's say we've got this player 1, we've got player 2. Let's go in order here. So let's put ourselves in the shoes of player 1 and say player 2 attacks East City. So what could I do? I could defend that city, or I could defend another city. Okay, so if I defend the East City, well, we're gonna have a lot of people die, and I'm gonna get a payoff of nothing. Okay, but if I defend the West City, then we're all good. I actually don't quite get this because then we're also losing a city, but I guess that's taken into account in the payoffs here. So I get a payoff of 1. Okay. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to get a payoff of 1, so I'm going to defend the West City if player 2 attacks the East City. If player 2 attacks the West City, well, if I defend the East City, I'll get a payoff of 1. And if I defend the West City, I get a payoff of 0. So I'm going to go with defending the East City. Now we do it for the other player, so let's do it for player 2. So player 1 could defend the East City. So what could I do as player 2? Well, I could attack the East City, get a payoff of 1, or I could attack West City, get a payoff of 0. So I'm gonna attack the East City. And player 1 could defend the West City. What would I want to do there? Well, I would want to attack the West City because I would get a payoff of 1, and they would get a payoff of 0. Excuse me. When I attack the West City, I would get a payoff of 1. If I attacked the East City, I would get a payoff of 0. Okay, so we see that there are no mutual best responses. So each one of these cells, we don't have a best response. So that could happen. Okay, this game called NIM, we're actually going to skip past that. This is a little too tough to do here. So this is normally an exercise I like to do in class for fun. So we also have another way that we could look at things, and we could look at things in a sequential way now. Okay, so all these other things we're thinking of doing these games simultaneously. But what if there's an order to things? What if there's time passing? People make choices, and then you make other choices. So our way we're going to solve that is through what we call backwards induction. Okay, so that basically means we're going to start at the end, the very last thing, and we're going to work our way back from the goal we see at the end to the first move. Okay, so here's an example of this. In the movie E.T., so I don't know how dated E.T. is now, if everyone has seen that, but there was a product placement for Reese's Pieces, which was a Hershey brand, and that was used to lure the E.T. into the house. And Reese's Pieces really did really well after that, allowing Hershey to catch up with its rival, which is Mars. But originally, the plan was to use Mars. So Mars has M&M's, which was its rival, but Mars didn't turn down the offer. So then, who did they go to? They went to Hershey, and Hershey accepted the deal for $1 million, and it turned out to be very favorable for them. And as we're talking about rivals here, if it's favorable to them, it's unfavorable to their rival. Okay, so publicity from the M&M's product placement increased Mars profits by 800,000, decreases Hershey's by 100,000. Okay, but we could live in this world where publicity from Reese's Pieces product placement would increase Hershey's profits by 1.2 million and decreases Mars by 500,000. Okay, so these are the two situations that happen. We saw that this one right here was the one that did happen in real life, but these are just some ideas. So if neither of them gets put in the movie, maybe they made up some sort of a candy, then we would just have everyone going on business as usual. In other words, maybe a payoff of zero for both of them. Okay, so basically what happened here was the offer was first given to Mars, and they had the choice to buy or not buy. If they bought, the game was over. But if they didn't buy, then Hershey got the choice whether or not they could buy or not buy. And if none of them bought, then we'd get business as usual, 0-0, and these other payoffs for these other circumstances. So if Mars did not buy and Hershey did, then Mars would get a payoff of negative 500 and Hershey would get a payoff of 200. So this is kind of the same way of how we showed numbers in the normal form games, the simultaneous games. The first number is generally going to be for the first player. The second number is for the second player. And if Mars bought, they would have to pay out 200, but Hershey would pay out 100. So what in the world should we choose if these are the numbers we're given? What should be our equilibrium? Well, I kind of already solved it here because these little arrows are kind of indicating that. But let's kind of see. So with backwards induction, we start at the end. Okay, so the very last node we see is this one. Okay, and Hershey is the mover there, and they're going to choose whether or not they don't buy or buy. Well, if Hershey's the mover, what they really care about are their payoffs. If they don't buy, they get a payoff of 0. If they buy, they get a payoff of 200. Okay? Well, I think I have the arrow in the wrong place on this, actually. So I was like, why is that arrow there? So they would actually want to buy here. So that arrow's not right. They would want to get this 200, so they're going to buy. But now we go back, roll it back. We roll it back to this first round here. And Mars, they have to choose whether or not they're going to buy or don't buy. But here's the thing. Mars is smart. They know that if they don't buy, that Hershey's will buy. That's some information that they have. So if they buy, they get a payoff of negative 200. If they don't buy, then they get a payoff of negative 500. So this arrow is actually wrong too. So they should buy. They would lose 200, but if they didn't buy, then Hershey gets the deal, and they lose 500. So it's actually best if Mars would have bought. So how do we write the solution here? Well, what we need to do is we need to make sure we're including every little bit, every choice that is made. So, in other words, we should say that the equilibrium this rollback equilibrium is for Mars, player 1, to buy. Looks like bug. Let's rewrite that. To buy. And for player 2, Hershey, well, they should also buy. Okay, they're not going to get the chance to as it plays out because Mars will buy right away and then the game ends. But if given the chance, they would buy. So we when we're writing the equilibrium, we have to choose all of these best responses. So this is going to be our rollback equilibrium, is to buy. Okay. Here's another example. So this is a two-player game. So you and some other party start out with no money, and we can choose the game on your turn, or we can let the game continue. If the game continues, then we get $2 added to each person's bank account. But if the game ends, then the person whose turn it is, and therefore whoever has the power to end the game, gets to take $1 from their opponent's bank account. So when should this game end? Well, let's figure it out. So let's assume in this particular game we had a definite number of rounds, so this couldn't go on for infinity. Okay, so how do we solve this? Well, we use backwards induction. Let's start at the end. Okay, so at the end, we have this node here. Okay, and we've got this number here. This is the player. Okay, so it's player 1. So player 1 has the very last move. So player 1 could kind of honor their commitment to not end the game and take money from the opponent's bank account. And if that happens, player 1 gets a payoff of 7, and player 2 also gets a payoff of 7. But if they defect and they take $1 from their opponent, they get a payoff of 8, and their opponent gets 6 because they had $1 taken from their account. Okay, so what should player 1 do in this situation? Well, they have the choice of defecting, get it 8, or honoring their commitment, get it 7. They're gonna, if this is all the payoffs that they're gonna have to worry about, they're gonna defect. They're gonna get that 8. Okay, so the game's gonna end there. Let's roll it back though. So now let's roll it back in the prior round. So player 2 has control at this point. Player 2 could let the game continue or let the game end. Well, if player 2 lets the game continue, he or she knows that player 1 will defect, and they will get a payoff of 6. But if player 2 ends the game themselves, they get a payoff of 7. 7's going to be better, right? So they're going to end the game. And we roll it back again to where player 1 now has control. What do you think they're going to do? Well, they could end the game now, get a payoff of 6, or get a payoff of 5. 6 is better. They're going to end the game. And so on and so on. So we go all the way back to the beginning. Player 1 will end the game immediately, get a payoff of 2, which, by the way, is definitely worse than if they had not done that. Okay, so this is another example, kind of like the prisoner's dilemma, where we see if there was some cooperation, we would both be better off, but we have these individual incentives to deviate, to free ride, and that puts us in a situation where one person is getting 2, the other is getting nothing, where we could be in this situation where both of us got 7 if we cooperated. Okay, and this is how we would write that. Okay, so player 1, that's this first bit before the semicolon, they would end the game on their first turn, end the game the second time they get a chance, end the game the third time, and defect the last time. Player 2, they would end the game the first chance they got, the second chance they got, and the third chance they got. So a rollback equilibrium is end, 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 defect, end, end, end. Okay. We can also use this to figure out whether or not a monopolist, if we think about barriers to entry, we might maybe be able to figure out whether or not a new firm should enter the market or not. We've got this one big firm that's out there, but we've got this new firm that's thinking about entering, but they may not. So let's do another example here. Okay, so as usual, we're going to start at the end and roll back. We start at the end. So the Monopoly gets the second move. Okay, so they can choose to fight the entry of this new firm, or they could just accommodate them, let them in without a huge advertising war or something like that, right? So the Monopoly chooses to either fight and get a payoff of 10, or accommodate and get a payoff of 50. Well, 50 is going to be better for them, right? So they're going to accommodate if they choose to enter. Okay, so this new firm, we roll back to them, and they have to choose whether or not to stay out or enter. If they stay out, well, they don't get anything because they haven't entered the market. If they enter the market, well, they know that the monopolist is going to accommodate them and they're going to get a payoff of 30. So they're going to choose to enter. And if they enter, they will get accommodated, and so we will have in accommodate as our rollback equilibrium. Okay, and these are some other kind of toy games that I think we're going to kind of skip over, but I would like us to, if you want to read through these, why don't you guys let's do this one. Let's do the Traveler's Dilemma. So why don't you guys read through this on your own and shoot me an email with your answer, and then maybe we can do some extra credit for that. Okay, so if you've watched this far, maybe you can get some extra credit. How about that? All right, so shoot me an email with extra credit as the subject. Okay, and we'll skip that one. All right, so that's pretty much the basics, the super basics of game theory. So I'd like you to be able to solve those normal form games. So your homework's going to look like that. You should understand the concept of equilibria as we are referring to here. Obviously, we've talked about equilibria before, and it's a very similar situation. We don't have an incentive to deviate from it, right? We should know what backwards induction means. We should have knowledge of sequential games and what is our equilibrium concept for those. So it's rollback equilibrium. And we didn't really talk about risk averse, so we can ignore that. All right, so that's pretty much it for game theory. So I will post the solutions for this, or excuse me, not the solutions, I will post the homework for this, and I will post the reading for this online.